and welcome to Curious Minds. I hope you're having an amazing week as we are into May now. Lockdowns are starting to end. How you feeling? This is Evan Van Sickle coming at you again with some stuff on the Bible, on Bible inspiration, Bible reliability, and how we can test to see what Scripture really has the right to be called Scripture. Alright, prophecy. This is just one of the 10 tests for the inspiration of the Bible, or really tests for the inspiration of any Scripture. And the tests are, is the text impactful? Does it claim inspiration? Is it historically accurate? Is it scientifically consistent? Does it resolve properly the human condition? Does it contain prophecy, things that couldn't be known by the human mind? Does it contain coherent theology, unity? What's its authorship? And are there associated miracles? These are all tests we can apply to different religious texts. Unfortunately, I'm not much of an expert in a lot of the religious texts, but I'll bring up some of what they have to say, as well as dive deep into what the Bible has to say about this. So what is prophecy? Well, a definition, when you see pro from the Greek, that is beforehand or in advance, and the phaeteo or phaeteia, depending on if it's noun or verb, that is to say or to tell. So something said in advance is prophecy. Now, telling the future might not be all that prophecy implies. Sometimes it implies telling things that are going on in other places, or exposing things about the human heart, or what's God's intention for certain situations. But for the purposes of this test of inspiration, we'll focus on saying things in advance. Now, what do different religions have to say about prophecy? I'll just touch on a few of them. Baha'u'llah, he wrote quite a bit, but he and his son Abdul-Baha predicted many cultural things related to leaders and empires falling. So from a Baha'i individual, you would likely get claims that the writings have prophecy and thus have a mark of inspiration. The sayings and claims of Baha'u'llah, though, are not without their problems. He said that there are planets around all the other stars. False. Not all stars have planets. And he said that all these planets have creatures living in them. Also false. He claimed to be the second coming of Christ, but this didn't match up with what Jesus himself said about his return. Check out Matthew 24 and a Curious Minds podcast from about 8 months ago for more on that. There are Hindu predictions, but these Hindu predictions are simply an assessment of the human condition. So the same struggles that have happened 3,000 years ago are the same struggles of the human heart that happen now, not so much predictions. Also, there was a prediction of 50-year lifespans. Not sure that's too accurate. Muslims may refer to a prophecy that Rome would overcome Persia within 10 years. Was this predictable? Could be. But the original wording referred to within a few years. The word's meaning was stretched to include more time in order for it to fit the historical outcome, which really wasn't completed until about 14 years later. The entrance into Medina is another one that they might use. And that's just kind of a motivational speech and a self-fulfilled thing. The Book of Mormon and Mormonism itself have some issues with prophecy, one being the non-historical nature of the Book of Mormon, that's pretty obvious. The other being that Mormonism, the prophets, the presidents of the church, they're thought to be able to speak perfectly, kind of like how the Catholic Church views the Pope ex cathedra to speak flawlessly. These prophets would supposedly have these encounters with God and know exactly what to say in light of them. Well, Joseph Smith, founder and self-proclaimed prophet and author of Mormonism's most authoritative writings, ended up falsely predicting the coming of Christ, saying that it would be by the end of the 19th century. Whoops. Again, a problem with Jehovah's Witnesses and other faiths as they try to predict this great second coming of Christ. Shows them to be not true prophets. Therefore, the scripture, so-called, coming from them probably is not inspired of God either. Another difference you might notice is that prophecies can seem like detached pieces of information, not central to the claims of their respective faiths. In Bible prophecy, however, each one contributes to and relates deeply to the big story of Scripture. They're penned or foretold by numerous people who are telling the same story. So it's not one person saying these things. It is numerous people making the same predictions. They're often outside of the immediate window of time, so it's not something they see on the horizon, as some of these predictions forecast of other religious texts. And there was serious punishment associated with false prophecy. So you can't just write 5,000 prophecies and hope that a few of them come true. No. Once you're proved to be a false prophet, you can never be a prophet, and you will likely be killed. And the texts of the Bible are highly authentic. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. Showed that through the Dead Sea Scrolls and through the early manuscript evidence for the Bible that the writings did in fact take place at the times that they were said to take place. Are there any alternative explanations for the foretelling that takes place in prophecy? What type of things would skeptics bring up to try to show that prophecy is not legitimate or not dependent on any sort of supernatural knowledge? Could they be after the fact? Well, in Mormonism, you have some after-the-fact prophecies because you have predictions of Christ in a text written in 1830. So it works for that, but it can't work for the Bible for reasons I just mentioned. Well, maybe they're just super vague, and this is the accusation of Nostradamus. You have Nostradamus saying, "Under the feigned shadow of lifting servitude, people and city, he will usurp it himself." And surely every nation on earth could find a way to interpret that for the current time and the current location. He was deliberately vague. But in the Bible, you have specific nations named. Occasionally you have specific people named. You have a very specific time frame named, in Daniel 9 especially. So you have specifics in the Bible that you don't see with someone like Nostradamus. In the Bible, they're calling people out. They're calling them out because of either the provision or the judgment that might be coming upon a people. Maybe it's just chance. Maybe there's just so much writing that you're bound to find something that looks like prophecy in there. Well, if you write as much as the Vedas or something like that, I'm sure you could find something that seems to parallel big world events that you see. But you don't have that in the Bible so much. The Bible itself is not entirely prophecy. And the prophecies are specific enough to be able to tell, okay, that's for judgment of that certain time frame. This looks a little different. At the end of the day, you don't have a ton to choose from to be able to accumulate the number of fulfilled prophecies, which I've heard is around 2,000 in the Bible. Is it predictable stuff? Is it just stuff that's bound to happen anyway, or humans see it on the horizon? Well, Mormons say that Joseph Smith predicted the Civil War, but such a thing was predictable based on the cultural climate of that time. Sikh prophecies appear to be along these lines too. They kind of throw shade at all the nations, and a lot of them stick. That's kind of how Baha'u'llah was also. A few of the Islamic prophecies are pretty predictable too. Might they just be self-fulfilled then? I mean, if Jesus knew that there was a prophecy about him about riding into Jerusalem on a donkey and said, "Hey, go get a donkey, I need to fulfill this," are they just self-fulfilled? Well, remember, in that story, he specifically told them where they would find the donkey, and he would have no knowledge of knowing that. But again, the majority of Christological prophecies could not have been self-fulfilled. He couldn't control where and when he was born. So self-fulfillment might be relevant to some LDS and Islamic prophecies, but these regard the spread of their message. Yet I would say self-fulfillment, while it appears to potentially have some effect on certain Bible prophecies, is not sufficient to explain the nature of Bible prophecy. Let's remember what the Bible is and what it is not. It is not about wowing with prophecy, it's about preparing a people. There needs to be a purpose behind the prophecy, otherwise the prophecy is nothing but a magic show. So where does the Bible exhibit a special level of foretelling events? Prophecy in the Bible is broad in its scope, meaning that the historical narrative fits the storyline narrative, the overall message of the Bible also. So broadly, it's prophetic, and it's in the things that people probably thought were just happenstance, like naming your children. What's the big deal there? Or, oh, when I take my boy up the mountain, there'll be a ram caught in the thicket. Not overthinking it in the moment, goes to demonstrate something big. And it's also narrow in its scope. So there's certain details that you find also. So the broad scope is prophetic. The narrow details are often prophetic as well. So we're going to look at 4 major places where amazing examples of prophecy take place. Israel's history, Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, and in the life of Christ, specifically the book of Matthew. In Israel's history, you have Genesis 5, the genealogy from Adam through Noah. That is Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. And these name meanings essentially spell out the gospel message. Man is appointed, mortal sorrow, but the blessed God shall come down. teaching that his death shall bring the despairing rest. If you had to summarize the Bible, who would have thought that a genealogy from before the flood would do it? And there's Genesis 12 and 22 with Abraham. Abraham is called and given the promise. You're going to have a son. You're going to be the father of many nations. He's 100 years old and childless. And by the way, he takes this child, this only begotten son, up a mountain, quite possibly the same mountain that Jesus ascended for his crucifixion. And that is where the ram is caught in the thicket. The ram, the king, in the thicket with the crown of thorns. That became the substitutionary sacrifice so that Abraham would not have to sacrifice his child. Again, the gospel spelled out in story. There's promises of protection and provision for the nation of Israel. And the whole biblical theme becomes typified just in the historical overview of Israel throughout that Old Testament period. You have slavery, freedom, and conquest. You have sin, judgment, a promise, a redeemer, a sacrifice, his presence, a cleansing, forgiveness, and permanence spelled out in the historical narrative of Israel's history. So that's broad. Even more specific, you have Psalm 22, which is 1,000 years before Christ. Let's look at some of the things just in this one song that David wrote. The Messiah is going to feel forsaken. He cries out frequently. He's a reproach and despised. People sneer and mock. They'll say, "Let God rescue him if he wants." He has a special designation from birth. He says that bulls from Bashan surround him. That would become Syria, the Gentiles, and later Rome. They're loud and harsh in their treatment. He's going to feel dehydrated and drained of energy. His bones will be out of joint, making perfect sense on a cross. His heart feels like it melts within him, feeling overworked. He's without strength. He's thirsty. He's surrounded by evildoers, presumably Gentile nations. He'll be buried in the place of dead people. They'll pierce his hands and his feet. Amazing. How would that even be predictable at a time hundreds of years before crucifixion was even invented? Nothing of the sort was invented by that time, and it was included in this Christological psalm. He'll have no broken bones. Most people who die on crosses wind up having broken bones to finish them off. Not so with Christ. He had the spear wound. There'll be onlookers throughout, so a public killing. They tear off sections of clothing and they cast lots for it. They gamble for pieces of his clothes. But the Lord is there to help. The ends of the earth will praise in light of it. Even the dead will acknowledge and worship. Those are 22 specific predictions in Psalm 22. Isaiah 53 has even a few more. This 700 years before Christ. This suffering servant, this Messiah, will have a marred appearance beyond any man. It is a sprinkling for the nations. He will silence kings. They'll comprehend things previously unknown. He's unattractive and unmajestic in his appearance. He's despised and forsaken of men. He's a man of sorrows and well acquainted with grief. He's unesteemed. He bore our griefs. He carried our sorrows. We considered him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. No broken bones, yet crushed. What could that look like? Oh, like a crucifixion. And again, mentioning piercings. He was chastened for our well-being. We're healed by his scourging. Our iniquities fall on him. He's oppressed. He was silent like a lamb to the slaughter. He was taken away for the purpose of judgment. He was considered dead and gone. His grave was assigned with wicked men. He was with a rich man in his death. Remember, the guy who asked for the body of Jesus was the rich man who owned the tomb. He did no violence, no deceit in his mouth. This pleased the Lord. Wait a minute. This pleased the Lord. He became a guilt offering. He will have offspring. This, of course, referring to those who are grafted in, adopted as sons of God. He will live on. A resurrection? God will see it and be satisfied. The servant will justify many. He will bear their iniquities. He will be rewarded. He will give his life. He was with the transgressors. He will bear their sins. He will stand in the gap for transgressors. It's about 36 specific prophecies about the type of death that the Messiah would die. Combine that with Psalm 22, that's 58 right there in 2 chapters. Some have said there are about 108 prophecies in total that refer to the life and the ministry of the Messiah. Now, the book of Matthew has got about 49 prophecies that Matthew is intentionally drawing on from the Old Testament to show, hey, this Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah. He's a Jew writing to the Jews, showing them from the Scripture that Jesus is the Messiah, just like they would do through the book of Acts. Here's how Matthew did it. The virgin was going to have a child, who they're going to call Emmanuel, which means God with us. His birthplace will be Bethlehem. Joseph takes the Christ to Egypt during Herod's infanticide, so out of Egypt I have called my son becomes fulfilled. Weeping and grief over Herod's slaughter, predicted in Jeremiah 31:15. This family will return from Egypt and live in Nazareth. There's a voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord. That's John the Baptist foretold in Isaiah 40, verse 3. Jesus moved to Capernaum. People who were living in Zebulun beyond the Jordan, who were living in darkness, saw a great light. That's from Isaiah 9:1. Jesus frees the demon-possessed and heals the sick. So he took our infirmities and sicknesses. Pharisees conspired against Jesus, but Jesus continued to go out healing. My beloved shall proclaim justice to the Gentiles, says Isaiah 42, 1 and 2. Jesus says, look for the sign of Jonah, Jonah 1:17. 3 days, 3 nights in the belly of the fish, 3 days, 3 nights in the belly of the earth. Jesus will speak to them in parables. There's even one section where it says he didn't speak to them except for in parables. That's according to Psalm 78:2, 1,000 years before Christ. Parables will keep the unfaithful from understanding, according to Isaiah 6, verse 9. These people, Pharisees and scribes, they honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me, fulfilling Isaiah 29:13. In Jerusalem, Jesus will be delivered into the hands of sinners, mocked, scourged, killed, and raised to life on the third day. That's Jesus' own prediction of himself. Jesus rides into Jerusalem for the final time on a donkey. Your king is coming to you on a donkey, says Zechariah 9:9. And then there's a slew of prophecies in Matthew 24. Prophecies that Jesus makes about the coming tribulation, desolation. Part of this predicted back in Daniel 11:31 and 9:27, fulfilled at least in part in 70 AD, when no stone in the temple was left on any other. A very specific prophecy, a very bold prophecy made by Jesus. Judas will betray Jesus. Close friend who ate with me lifted his heel against me, fulfilling Psalm 41:9. Jesus predicted, this is my last meal to drink. How did he know that? He said, you will abandon me. You're all going to abandon me. How did he know that? He predicted that he would be raised. Predicted that Peter would deny him 3 times that night. He said he's about to be delivered in the hands of sinners. He told the people arresting him that this is all fulfilling what's written in the scriptures and in the prophets. He said, destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days, talking about the temple of his body. Jesus is silent before his accusers. You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven, from Daniel 7:13. He'll be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, according to Zechariah 11:13. These 30 pieces of silver, this slave price, would go to buy a potter's field. Also Zechariah 11:13. Jesus is crucified, which is nailing hands and feet to beams of wood, fulfilling Psalm 22:16 and Zechariah 12:10. They gave him wine and gall to drink during his torture, from Psalm 69:21. They'll divide his clothing and cast lots for it. Those who see scoff, mock, and wag their heads at him. They say he trusts in God, let him save him if he delights in him. The light of the Lord is present. Darkness covers the earth before the Lord rises and shines on them again, according to Isaiah 60, verse 2. After Jesus cried out, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, the earth shook, fulfilling Psalm 18:7. He was buried in the tomb of a rich man. And all authority was given to Jesus Christ for glory in the nations of the world, according to Daniel 7:14. Right there we hit about 100, a little over 100 Bible prophecies. As I said, there are about 2,000. There's a whole lot more that deal with the surrounding nations around Israel. Most memorable is the prophecy of the city of Tyre. It is going to be destroyed, never to be rebuilt again. Now, a city with that much prominence, to say that it wouldn't be built again was pretty bold. And it said more than that. It said that it would go out to sea, like the destruction of the city would go out to sea, and it would become a place for casting fishing nets, which is exactly what's happened, and I think it's still like that today. The Tyre's not there, but the rocks that make up the seashore are a popular place for the fishermen to spread their nets. Lots of other prophecies about the nation surrounding Israel, more prophecies about the life of Christ we could look at. Don't have time for that, but we need to ask, what does this all mean? Well, getting back to what prophecy does, there's this little syllogism. Supernatural knowledge requires a supernatural source. Bible prophecy is supernatural knowledge. Therefore, Bible prophecy is from a supernatural source. Now, the content then seems to be intended and affirmed by God, since God is the only one sufficient to have such foreknowledge. So God's the predictor of the things in the Bible, showing that he affirms the things written therein in Scripture. And what is the purpose from God's perspective, from Jesus' perspective of prophecy? John 13:19, Jesus said, nearing the end of his time on earth with his disciples, he said, "From now on, I'm telling you before it comes to pass, so that when it does occur, you may believe that I am he." And that is a very special term for I am he. It's the ego eimi. Believe Jesus, believe God, the I am. Prophecy was for the sake of provoking faith in his disciples. And back in Isaiah 46:9 and 10, Isaiah writes, under the inspiration, "Remember the former things long past, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things which have not been done, saying, my purpose will be established, and I will accomplish all my good pleasure." Through the prophets, God was saying, here is proof that I am speaking, that I am accomplishing my will, because I'm declaring things that have yet to come. And issued the challenge, if somebody else can do this, try me. And at that time, nobody could step up to the test of fulfilled prophecy like Yahweh God, the true God, the Lord and Creator. And still to this day, I'd argue the same thing's going on. Nothing else matches up to the same level of fulfilled prophecy as the Bible, because God is affirming in it the message. So this lends great weight to the idea that the Bible contains the marks of divine inspiration. This alone, prophecy, is probably sufficient. However, this is just one of the 10 tests for the inspiration of the Bible. This is number 6. The previous 5 have also strongly shown that the Bible is a work consistent with divine inspiration. Necessary and sufficient evidence is good for reaching verdicts or conclusions. Many of the previous points were necessary for divine inspiration, not necessarily sufficient, yet this point on prophecy is sufficient. Now we're having the mix of necessary and sufficient evidence for the divine inspiration of the Bible. And since the Bible is measured up to a level much higher than these other so-called scriptural texts, I would argue it's the Bible and the Bible alone that shows the marks of divine inspiration. You might think about getting to know the message that it has. And next time, since there's still 4 more of these tests for inspiration, we'll look at theology. Does it have a coherent definition of God? We'll look at unity. Does it share one message? We'll look at authorship. And we'll look at associated miracles. Coming up soon on Curious Minds. Hey, it's a pleasure bringing this to you guys. You enjoy. We'll talk to you again soon. Love you all. And may God bless and guide you.